There is a type of person who cannot help but think deeply, who encounters a simple question and immediately sees layers beneath it, who hears a statement and automatically analyzes its assumptions, who experiences life not just as series of events but as puzzles demanding interpretation, as patterns requiring recognition, as mysteries calling for understanding that most people never seek. These are the deep thinkers, the individuals for whom thought is not occasional activity but is constant background process, who cannot turn off the analytical mind even when it would be easier or more socially acceptable to simply accept what is presented without examination. The psychology of deep thinkers is not simply about intelligence or education or cognitive capacity. Many highly intelligent people are not deep thinkers, can apply their intelligence to specific problems without this bleeding into constant examination of everything, can think powerfully when needed without being unable to stop thinking when thought is not required. And many deep thinkers are not formally educated, did not develop this tendency through academic training, but possess it as fundamental orientation toward experience, as way of being in the world that was present long before they had language to describe it. Deep thinking is psychological orientation, is particular relationship to reality characterized by inability to accept surface explanations, by compulsion to understand rather than simply to know, by need to see patterns and connections and implications that others miss or ignore, by discomfort with ambiguity that drives toward resolution through analysis, even when resolution is impossible. This orientation brings gifts, insight, understanding, capacity to see what others cannot see, ability to solve complex problems, depth of engagement with ideas and with existence itself. But it also brings costs: isolation, exhaustion, difficulty with simple social interaction, tendency toward anxiety and depression, sense of being fundamentally different from most people who seem content with superficiality that the deep thinker finds unbearable. Understanding the psychology of deep thinkers means understanding both the gifts and the costs, both what makes this orientation valuable and what makes it difficult, both how it serves understanding and how it creates suffering. The deep thinker's orientation toward reality begins early, often in childhood, manifests as endless questions that exhaust parents and teachers, as need to understand why rather than simply accepting that, as dissatisfaction with answers that do not explain but only describe or deflect or tell the child to stop asking. The deep-thinking child is the one who asks why the sky is blue and is not satisfied with because it just is, who asks where people go when they die and is not comforted by simple religious explanations, who notices contradictions in what adults say and points them out without recognizing that this is socially inappropriate. This tendency is not chosen or cultivated but emerges naturally, feels like fundamental aspect of how the mind works, rather than like skill that was learned or habit that was developed. The deep thinker cannot remember a time when they did not analyze, did not question, did not see beneath surface to the structures and patterns and assumptions that others seem not to notice or care about. This creates sense of having always been different, of never quite fitting in, of watching other children accept what was told to them, while feeling compulsive need to understand why it was true, whether it was consistent, what it implied about other things. The orientation intensifies through experiences of discovering that surface explanations are often wrong, that what people say frequently contradicts what they do, that the world as presented by authorities does not match the world as actually experienced. The child learns that adults lie, not always maliciously but casually, tell comforting falsehoods rather than difficult truths, maintain contradictory beliefs without apparent distress, say one thing and do another without recognizing the inconsistency. This discovery validates the deep thinker's instinct to question rather than accept, reinforces the tendency to look beneath surface, creates pattern where trust must be earned through logical consistency rather than granted based on authority or social convention. But this orientation also creates problems. The deep-thinking child is often labeled as difficult, as too serious, as overthinking everything, as unable to just relax and accept things as they are. Teachers become frustrated with endless questions that disrupt lesson plans. Peers find the constant analyzing exhausting or weird. Parents may appreciate the intelligence, but wish the child could be more normal, could play without turning games into examinations of rules and fairness and underlying logic, could watch movies without analyzing plot holes and character motivations and thematic inconsistencies. The deep thinker learns early that their natural way of engaging with reality is not valued by most people, that what feels like normal thought process to them appears abnormal to others, that the questions they cannot help asking make people uncomfortable or annoyed or defensive. This creates split between internal experience and external presentation, between the constant analytical process happening in the mind and the performance of normalcy required for social acceptance. The deep thinker learns to hide their thinking, to ask fewer questions aloud while continuing to ask them internally, to appear to accept surface explanations while privately maintaining skepticism and continuing analysis. This split creates what becomes a characteristic feature of the deep thinker: the sense of living in two worlds simultaneously, the social world where they perform appropriate responses and maintain acceptable level of superficiality, and the internal world where the real engagement with ideas and patterns and implications continues without interruption. Most people seem to live primarily in the social world, seem genuinely satisfied with surface explanations, seem not to be constantly analyzing and questioning and seeking deeper understanding. The deep thinker lives primarily in the internal world, with the social world being performance space, where they must translate their actual thoughts into socially acceptable form. This creates exhaustion that others do not experience or understand. Social interaction requires constant translation, requires monitoring what can be said and what must be kept internal, requires performing interest in conversations that feel painfully superficial while suppressing the impulse to push toward depth that would make others uncomfortable. The deep thinker leaves social situations drained, not from the interaction itself, but from the effort of maintaining the performance, of holding back the natural tendency to analyze and question, of pretending that small talk is satisfying when it feels like waste of time that could be spent thinking about things that actually matter. The orientation also creates relationship difficulties. The deep thinker needs conversations that engage at depth, needs to discuss ideas and patterns and implications, needs intellectual stimulation that most people either cannot provide or do not want to provide. Friendships often feel unsatisfying because they remain at surface level, because attempts to go deeper are met with resistance or incomprehension, because the deep thinker's natural mode of engagement is not what most people seek in friendship. Romantic relationships face similar challenges. The deep thinker needs a partner who can engage intellectually, who can follow and contribute to complex analyses, who finds depth appealing rather than exhausting or pretentious. The psychology of the deep thinker is therefore characterized from early age by this fundamental difference in how reality is engaged, by compulsive need to understand that others do not share, by constant analytical process that cannot be turned off, by split between internal depth and external performance, by exhaustion from maintaining this split, by difficulty finding relationships that can accommodate the need for intellectual engagement and depth. The deep thinker's cognitive process is characterized by what might be called compulsive analysis, the inability to encounter information without automatically examining its logic, its assumptions, its implications, its connections to other information, its place within larger patterns. This is not deliberate choice, but is automatic response, is how the mind processes everything by default. A casual statement from a friend triggers analysis of what assumptions underlie the statement, whether it is logically consistent, what it reveals about the friend's beliefs or psychology, how it connects to other things they have said, whether it contradicts previous positions they have taken. This constant analysis operates in background, even when attention is focused elsewhere. creates what feels like parallel processing, where one part of mind engages with immediate social or practical demands, while another part continues analyzing, questioning, seeking patterns, drawing connections. The deep thinker can be having conversation while simultaneously analyzing the conversation structure, noticing verbal patterns, detecting inconsistencies, recognizing emotional subtext, predicting where the conversation is likely to go based on observed patterns. This is not conscious effort, but is automatic functioning, is how the mind works without needing to be directed. The compulsive nature means that deep thinkers cannot simply choose to think less deeply or to accept surface explanations when this would be more convenient or socially appropriate. Telling a deep thinker to stop overthinking is like telling them to stop breathing, is requesting that they cease fundamental cognitive process that is not under voluntary control. They can suppress the expression of their analysis, can choose not to articulate the questions and observations and implications they are seeing, but they cannot stop the process itself, cannot prevent the automatic deeper examination of everything they encounter. This creates particular relationship to pattern recognition. The deep thinker's mind is constantly seeking patterns, is looking for underlying structures that connect apparently disparate phenomena, is trying to find the organizing principles that explain why things are as they are, rather than some other way. When pattern is recognized, when connections are seen that were not visible before, this provides intense satisfaction, feels like understanding has been achieved, like chaos has been organized into coherent structure. This satisfaction drives continued pattern seeking, creates positive feedback loop where successful recognition reinforces the tendency to look for patterns everywhere. But this pattern seeking has shadow side. The mind that cannot help seeing patterns will sometimes see patterns that are not there, will find connections that are coincidental rather than meaningful, will construct elaborate explanations for phenomena that are actually random or that have simpler explanations than the complex theories the deep thinker develops. The deep thinker is vulnerable to certain forms of conspiracy thinking not because they are gullible, but because they are pattern-seeking, because their mind automatically constructs explanations that connect dots, even when the dots should not be connected. The deep thinker also has complex relationship with ambiguity and uncertainty. On one hand, they can tolerate ambiguity better than many people because they recognize that simple answers are often wrong, that reality is complex, that certainty is rare and should not be claimed prematurely. They are comfortable saying, "I don't know," when others would prefer a definitive answer, are willing to hold questions open rather than accepting inadequate explanations just to have closure. But on the other hand, the compulsive analysis is partly driven by discomfort with not understanding, by need to resolve uncertainty through examination, by drive to figure out what is actually happening beneath surface confusion. The deep thinker can spiral into excessive analysis when faced with situations that resist understanding, can become obsessed with finding explanations when explanations may not exist, can exhaust themselves pursuing clarity that cannot be achieved. The inability to simply accept "that's just how it is" means that unsolvable mysteries create ongoing cognitive tension, create problems that the mind cannot stop working on, even when continued work is clearly not producing progress. This relationship to uncertainty affects decision-making. The deep thinker sees multiple possibilities, recognizes numerous factors that might be relevant, understands implications and potential consequences that others miss. This thoroughness can improve decision quality but can also create paralysis, can make simple choices complicated, can turn what should be quick decision into extended analysis that delays action while examining options from every possible angle. The deep thinker struggles with decisions not because they cannot think clearly, but because they think too clearly, see too many considerations, recognize too many uncertainties that should be factored into the choice. The constant analysis also creates what might be called cognitive overwhelm, the sense that there is always more to think about than time or mental energy allows, that every question leads to 10 more questions, that understanding one thing reveals 10 things that are not yet understood, that the project of comprehending reality is infinite while mental resources are finite. This can create anxiety, can make the deep thinker feel perpetually behind in their thinking, perpetually inadequate to the task of understanding everything they feel compelled to understand. The deep thinker's relationship to emotion is complicated by the tendency to analyze feelings rather than simply experiencing them, to try to understand why they feel what they feel, rather than allowing the emotion to exist without interrogation. Sadness is not just sadness, but becomes question. Why am I sad? What triggered this? What does it mean about my psychology or my situation? Is this feeling proportionate to circumstances, or is it revealing something deeper? Anger becomes examination of whether the anger is justified, what assumptions underlie it, whether it is being directed at the actual source or is being displaced from somewhere else. This analytical relationship to emotion creates distance from the direct experience, creates observer stance where part of the mind is always watching and interpreting the emotional state rather than being fully immersed in it. This can be protective, can prevent being completely overwhelmed by intense emotions, can allow for rational assessment even while feeling strongly. But it also prevents the kind of unreflective emotional experience that others have, prevents simply feeling without simultaneously thinking about the feeling, prevents the temporary relief that comes from being lost in emotion without the observing consciousness that analyzes it. The deep thinker often experiences emotions as data to be interpreted, rather than as states to be accepted. They notice patterns in their emotional responses, recognize triggers, understand the psychological mechanisms that produce certain feelings. This understanding does not eliminate the emotions, but changes the relationship to them, creates awareness that what is being felt is not simply reaction to present circumstances, but is complex product of past experiences, learned patterns, unconscious associations, biochemical states. The emotion becomes less about the present trigger and more about recognizing the internal processes that the trigger activated. This can create what feels like emotional alienation, the sense of being separated from one's own feelings by the constant analytical process, of never quite having direct emotional experience, because the analyzing mind is always interpreting, always questioning, always seeking to understand rather than simply to feel. The deep thinker may long for the kind of unreflective emotional engagement that others seem to have, the capacity to be happy without analyzing why they are happy, to be sad without interrogating the sadness, to be angry without examining whether the anger is justified. But emotional alienation is not the only pattern. Many deep thinkers experience emotions with unusual intensity precisely because they think deeply about them, because they recognize implications and meanings that others miss, because they connect present emotional experience to larger existential patterns. The deep thinker who feels grief may experience not just loss of the particular person, but may simultaneously feel the larger reality of mortality, the inevitability of losing everyone eventually, the fundamental impermanence of all relationships. This is not catastrophizing, but is recognizing the larger truth that the particular loss reveals, is seeing the universal in the specific in ways that intensify the emotional experience. The deep thinker also has complex relationship with meaning and purpose. The compulsive need to understand extends to fundamental questions about why anything matters, what gives life purpose, whether meaning is discovered or created, how to justify continued existence in a universe that may be fundamentally indifferent. These are not abstract philosophical questions, but are lived concerns that affect motivation, that create existential weight that others may not carry, that make simple activities complicated by the question of whether they serve any real purpose beyond immediate gratification or social expectation. This search for meaning can be paralyzing because the deep thinker cannot accept easy answers, cannot simply adopt religious framework or ideological certainty or conventional success metrics without examining their foundations and often finding them inadequate. They recognize that most sources of meaning are socially constructed, are human inventions rather than cosmic truths, are maintained through collective agreement rather than through correspondence to objective reality. This recognition does not make the meanings false, but does make them less solid, less capable of providing the kind of certainty that would end the questioning. The result is often what existentialists called living in the question, existing in ongoing examination of meaning and purpose without arriving at final answers, continuing to ask whether life has purpose while simultaneously living as if it does, holding the tension between intellectual recognition that meaning is constructed and practical necessity of acting as if chosen meanings are worth pursuing. This is not comfortable position, but is characteristic stance of deep thinker, who cannot accept simple answers, but also cannot stop living while waiting for adequate answers that may never come. The deep thinker therefore lives with existential weight that others may not feel, with awareness of mortality and meaninglessness, and the constructed nature of values that is always present in background, even during moments of engagement and enjoyment and apparent purpose. This awareness cannot be turned off, cannot be forgotten even when it would be more pleasant to live unreflectively, creates burden, that is price of seeing clearly what others can ignore. The deep thinker's most painful struggle is often not the thinking itself, but is the isolation it creates, the sense of being fundamentally alone even when surrounded by people, of having thoughts and observations and questions that cannot be shared because others do not think this way, do not want to engage at this level, find the depth exhausting or pretentious or simply incomprehensible. This is not loneliness that comes from lack of social contact, but is intellectual and existential loneliness, is the recognition that most people cannot or will not meet you where you actually live. In the world of ideas and analysis and constant questioning, this isolation begins early when the deep thinking child realizes that their questions annoy or confuse peers, that what they find fascinating others find boring, that their way of playing or conversing or engaging with the world is not what other children want. They learn to hide the depth, to perform at the level others can engage with, to translate complex thoughts into simplified versions that will not trigger incomprehension or rejection. But this performance does not eliminate the isolation, only hides it, creates surface connection, while the actual person remains unknown and unmet. In adolescence, the isolation often intensifies as intellectual differences become more pronounced. As the deep thinker encounters ideas and philosophical questions that peers are not interested in or are not capable of engaging with at the level the deep thinker needs. The teenager who wants to discuss existentialism or epistemology or the nature of consciousness finds that others want to discuss sports or gossip or entertainment that attempts to shift conversation toward depth are met with blank stares or active resistance or mockery. The deep thinker learns that their interests mark them as weird, as trying too hard, as being unable to just be normal and talk about normal things. This creates what might be called the performance of normalcy, the constant effort to engage at the level others prefer, to show interest in topics that feel trivial, to suppress the impulse to analyze and question and push toward depth, to laugh at jokes that are not funny, to participate in conversations that feel like waste of time. The deep thinker becomes skilled at this performance, can maintain it for hours or days, can appear to be normally engaged while internally feeling completely disconnected, while the real thoughts continue in parallel track that never gets expressed. But the performance is exhausting, requires constant monitoring and self-suppression, creates sense of living inauthentically, of showing the world a version of yourself that is not real, while the actual person remains hidden and unknown. The deep thinker returns from social situations drained not from the interaction but from the performance, from holding back what they actually want to say, from pretending that surface engagement is satisfying, from the effort of being someone they are not. The search for intellectual peers, for people who can engage at depth without finding it exhausting or threatening, becomes crucial for the deep thinker's well-being. Finding even one person who thinks similarly, who asks the same kinds of questions, who wants to analyze and examine and understand, rather than simply accepting surface explanations. This can provide relief from the isolation that is otherwise constant. These connections are rare, and are treasured when found, become relationships where the performance can be dropped, where actual thoughts can be expressed, where depth is welcomed rather than rejected. But even with intellectual peers, complete understanding is rare. Each deep thinker has their own patterns of thought, their own areas of focus, their own particular way of analyzing and questioning. The connection is partial, is better than the isolation of having no one who understands, but is still not complete meeting, still involves some level of translation and compromise. The deep thinker may spend entire life searching for someone who thinks exactly as they do, who needs the same level of depth, who asks the same questions, and may never find this perfect intellectual match. The isolation also creates vulnerability to certain psychological patterns. The deep thinker who cannot find intellectual connection may retreat into solitary thought, may spend increasing amounts of time alone with books and ideas, may develop rich internal life while external relationships atrophy. This solitude can be productive, can allow for depth of thought that social engagement interrupts, but can also become trap, can create increasing difficulty with even surface social interaction, can lead to isolation that is no longer chosen but has become habitual and difficult to break. The deep thinker may also develop what appears to others as arrogance or condescension, may seem to look down on those who do not think deeply, may communicate superiority even when not intending to. This is often not actual belief in superiority, but is defensive response to years of feeling misunderstood and isolated, his way of protecting against the pain of not being met by deciding that others are simply incapable rather than that connection is possible but has not been found. The deep thinker's psychology creates particular vulnerability to anxiety and depression, not because thinking deeply is inherently pathological, but because the constant analysis, the inability to stop questioning, the recognition of complexity and uncertainty, and the constructed nature of meaning, all these create psychological conditions that make anxiety and depression more likely. The deep thinker sees not just what is, but what could go wrong, not just present circumstances, but all the ways they could deteriorate, not just current feelings, but all the reasons why happiness might be temporary, or might be based on illusions that could collapse at any moment. This is not pessimism or negative thinking, but is realistic assessment taken to its natural conclusion. The deep thinker who is happy recognizes that happiness depends on conditions that are impermanent, that relationships could end, that health could fail, that circumstances could change in ways that would eliminate the sources of current satisfaction. This recognition does not prevent happiness but shadows it, creates awareness that what exists now will not exist forever, that loss is inevitable even if timing is uncertain. This awareness can make happiness feel fragile, can create anxiety about its loss, even while it is being experienced. The tendency toward analysis also creates what might be called anticipatory anxiety, the mind running simulations of everything that could go wrong, imagining scenarios and their implications, preparing for possibilities that may never occur but cannot be dismissed, because the deep thinker recognizes that unlikely events do sometimes happen. This is not irrational worry, but is the analytical mind applied to future possibilities, is recognition that life contains risks and uncertainties that most people do not think about, because thinking about them is uncomfortable and does not prevent them from occurring anyway. But for the deep thinker, not thinking about possibilities does not make them less real, does not provide the comfort that ignorance gives to others. The deep thinker cannot choose to not see the risks, cannot decide to stop analyzing the vulnerabilities, cannot maintain the kind of unreflective optimism that allows others to move through life without constant awareness of everything that could go wrong. This creates baseline anxiety that is not about specific threats, but is about the general fragility of everything. The recognition that stability is temporary, and that circumstances that seem solid can change rapidly in ways that cannot be controlled or predicted. Depression in deep thinkers often has existential quality, is not simply about chemical imbalance or negative thinking patterns, but is about confronting the apparent meaninglessness of existence the recognition that most sources of meaning are constructed rather than discovered, that purposes people pursue are often arbitrary or are inherited rather than chosen, that achievement and success and connection all end in death that eliminates whatever was built. This is not distorted thinking, but is clear seeing of realities that others can ignore or can address through religious faith or ideological certainty, or simple refusal to think about ultimate questions. The deep thinker who becomes depressed often experiences not inability to think, but inability to stop thinking. Not lack of insight, but too much insight. Not failure to see meaning, but clear recognition of how fragile and constructed meaning is, how dependent on circumstances and beliefs that could change or could be revealed as inadequate. The depression is not failure of the thinking process, but is where the thinking process leads when it is allowed to run without constraints, when it examines ultimate questions without accepting easy answers, when it recognizes truths that are difficult to live with. This creates paradox, where what makes the deep thinker valuable, the capacity for insight and analysis and seeing beneath surface, is also what makes them vulnerable to psychological suffering. The same cognitive processes that allow for understanding create conditions for anxiety and depression. The inability to accept simple answers that creates intellectual depth also creates existential burden. The pattern recognition that reveals connections others miss also generates anticipatory anxiety about everything that could go wrong. The deep thinker therefore often must develop specific strategies for managing the psychological costs of their cognitive orientation. This might include deliberately limiting analysis in certain domains, consciously choosing not to think deeply about every aspect of life, creating boundaries around the analytical process that allow for some unreflective engagement with experience. It might include finding ways to discharge the cognitive tension through writing or conversation or creative work that gives expression to thoughts that cannot be shared in normal social interaction. But these strategies are always partial, are ways of managing rather than eliminating the costs, are methods for living with the orientation rather than changing it fundamentally. The deep thinker remains someone for whom thought is compulsive, for whom analysis cannot be fully controlled, for whom the world presents as constant puzzle demanding interpretation, as patterns requiring recognition, as mysteries calling for understanding that will never be complete. Despite the costs and challenges, the deep thinker's orientation brings genuine gifts, creates capacities that others lack, allows for insights and understanding that would be impossible without the compulsive analysis and constant questioning that also creates suffering. The deep thinker sees connections that others miss, recognizes patterns that remain invisible to surface engagement, understands implications that escape those who accept explanations without examination. This is not superiority, but is a different way of processing reality that has its own value, that contributes understanding that surface thinking cannot provide. The deep thinker excels at solving complex problems precisely because they cannot help but see the complexity, cannot accept simple solutions that ignore relevant factors, cannot stop analyzing until underlying structure is understood rather than merely addressed symptomatically. Where others see isolated issue requiring specific fix, the deep thinker sees system with multiple interacting components, sees how proposed solution might create unintended consequences, sees connections to other problems that suggest the issue is symptom of larger pattern rather than isolated difficulty. This systematic thinking makes deep thinkers valuable in contexts that require genuine understanding rather than quick fixes, that benefit from thorough analysis rather than from fast action based on surface assessment. They are the people who catch the flaws in plans that everyone else approved, who recognize the assumptions that turn out to be wrong, who see the risks that others dismissed or never considered. Their tendency to overthink, which creates paralysis in simple situations, becomes asset when the situation is genuinely complex and requires the kind of thorough examination that the deep thinker cannot help but provide. The deep thinker also contributes to cultural and intellectual development through their inability to accept conventional wisdom without examination, through their compulsion to question what others take for granted, through their recognition of contradictions and inconsistencies that others either do not see or choose to ignore. Progress in understanding requires people who cannot stop asking why, who cannot accept "that's just how it is" as adequate answer, who push toward deeper explanations even when this makes them unpopular or difficult. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the development of philosophy and psychology, and the human sciences all depended on deep thinkers who could not accept religious or traditional explanations, who needed to understand through observation and reason rather than through faith or authority, who were willing to question everything, including the foundations of their own society. The deep thinker's compulsive need to understand, which creates personal difficulty, also drives collective progress toward better understanding of reality. The deep thinker's work often becomes their salvation, becomes the context where the compulsive thinking that creates social difficulty becomes valued capacity, where the constant analysis finds productive outlet, where the need for depth can be satisfied without the performance of normalcy that social interaction requires. The scientist pursuing research questions, the philosopher examining fundamental assumptions, the writer exploring human psychology, the programmer solving complex logical problems. All these vocations can accommodate and value the deep thinker's orientation in ways that ordinary social life cannot. But the work must be genuinely engaging, must actually require depth rather than simply appearing to. Many jobs that seem like they should suit deep thinkers actually require primarily surface engagement, require following established procedures rather than questioning them, require efficiency rather than thoroughness, value speed over understanding. The deep thinker in such positions experiences the same frustration as in social situations, the same need to suppress the natural tendency to analyze and question, the same exhaustion from performing normalcy, while the actual cognitive processes remain unengaged. Finding work that genuinely uses the deep thinking capacity, that values the thoroughness and the questioning and the inability to accept simple answers, this can transform the orientation from burden into gift, can create context where what makes the deep thinker difficult in ordinary life makes them valuable professionally. The person who overthinks social situations becomes the researcher who catches experimental flaws others missed. The person who exhausts friends with constant analysis becomes the consultant who identifies problems before they become catastrophic. The person who cannot stop questioning becomes the innovator who recognizes that conventional approaches are based on assumptions that should be challenged. The deep thinker's capacity for synthesis, for seeing how apparently disparate ideas or fields connect, also creates potential for creative and intellectual breakthroughs that require crossing boundaries that others respect without questioning. The tendency to see patterns everywhere, which creates vulnerability to false connections, also creates capacity for genuine insight when the patterns recognized are real, when the connections seen are valid, when the synthesis reveals understanding that specialized expertise missed because it remained within conventional boundaries. The question that deep thinkers eventually confront is whether the orientation can be integrated rather than simply managed, whether it is possible to live well as deep thinker rather than constantly fighting against a tendency or suffering from its costs, whether the gifts can be accessed while the burdens are reduced, whether some reconciliation is possible between the need for depth and the requirements of ordinary life that often rewards superficiality over substance. Integration begins with accepting the orientation rather than wishing it were different, recognizing that the compulsive thinking is not flawed to be corrected, but is a fundamental aspect of how the mind works, that trying to become less analytical or less questioning is fighting against cognitive structure that cannot be fundamentally changed. The deep thinker who spends energy trying not to overthink, trying to accept surface explanations, trying to be more normal, is wasting resources that could be directed toward making the orientation work rather than trying to eliminate it. This acceptance does not mean resignation, but means working with the tendency rather than against it, finding contexts where deep thinking is valued, creating outlets for the constant analysis, developing strategies that allow for depth where it serves, while preventing it from creating paralysis where quick action is needed. The deep thinker learns when to engage the full analytical capacity and when to deliberately limit it, learns which questions are worth pursuing and which are rabbit holes that will consume energy without producing useful understanding, learns when depth serves and when it becomes obstacle. The integration also requires finding intellectual community, finding the rare others who think similarly, who value depth, who want to engage with ideas rather than just with surface phenomena. This might be through academic contexts, through online communities organized around specific intellectual interests, through book groups or discussion forums or friendships formed around shared need for analytical engagement. The isolation that characterizes much of the deep thinker's life can be reduced through these connections, even when they are partial or limited to specific domains. But integration also means accepting that complete understanding will never be achieved, that the analytical mind will always find more questions than answers, that the project of comprehending reality is infinite while life is finite. The deep thinker must develop capacity to live with unresolved questions, to pursue understanding while accepting that certainty is rare and should not be expected, to find satisfaction in the process of thinking rather than only in the achievement of definitive conclusions. This means developing what might be called intellectual humility, recognizing that the deep thinking capacity that reveals so much also has limitations, that patterns recognized might be false, that analyses might be wrong, that the complexity seen might be partly projection of the mind's own tendency to complicate rather than accurate reflection of reality. The deep thinker who lacks this humility becomes trapped in their own constructions, becomes unable to recognize when they are wrong, becomes so committed to their analyses that they cannot update when evidence contradicts them. The integration also requires recognizing that depth is not always valuable, that some situations genuinely benefit from simple engagement rather than from analytical examination, that relationships can be damaged by constant analysis, that some experiences are best approached with presence rather than with interpretation. The deep thinker learns when to deploy the analytical capacity and when to deliberately set it aside, learns that not everything needs to be understood, learns that some forms of engagement require accepting surface as sufficient rather than always pushing toward depth. This selective engagement is not suppression, but is conscious choice about where to direct the analytical energy, is recognition that the capacity is limited resource that should be used strategically rather than applied indiscriminately to everything encountered. The deep thinker who learns this develops more balanced life, can engage deeply where it matters, while allowing other domains to remain at surface level without this creating the frustration of unexplored questions. The deep thinker also benefits from developing ways to quiet the analytical mind temporarily through meditation or physical activity, or creative pursuits that engage different cognitive processes, through practices that create breaks from the constant thinking without trying to eliminate the tendency entirely. These breaks prevent the exhaustion that comes from never stopping, create restoration that allows the analytical capacity to function better when it is engaged, prevents the cognitive overwhelm that occurs when every waking moment is spent in analysis. But even with integration, even with acceptance and strategic engagement and intellectual community and practices that create temporary quiet, the deep thinker remains fundamentally oriented toward depth, remains someone for whom surface engagement is never fully satisfying, remains a person who cannot help but see beneath, cannot help but question, cannot help but analyze. This is not a problem to be solved, but is way of being in the world that brings both gifts and costs, both insight and isolation, both understanding and existential weight. Conclusion. The psychology of deep thinkers reveals a particular cognitive orientation characterized by compulsive analysis, inability to accept surface explanations, constant pattern seeking, need to understand rather than simply to know, tendency to see complexity and connections that others miss or ignore, This orientation is not chosen or learned, but emerges naturally, feels like fundamental aspect of how the mind works rather than like skill that was developed, creates way of engaging with reality that is present from early childhood and persists throughout life. The orientation brings significant gifts. Deep thinkers see connections others miss, solve complex problems through systematic analysis, contribute to cultural and intellectual progress through their inability to accept conventional wisdom without examination, bring thoroughness and insight to work that genuinely requires depth rather than speed. Their compulsive questioning, which creates social difficulty, also drives the understanding that benefits collective knowledge, that challenges assumptions, that reveals flaws in thinking that surface engagement cannot detect. But the costs are substantial. The deep thinker experiences isolation from those who cannot or will not engage at the required depth, exhaustion from constant analysis that cannot be turned off, difficulty with social interaction that rewards superficiality over substance, vulnerability to anxiety and depression that comes from seeing too clearly what others can ignore, existential weight from recognizing the constructed nature of meaning and the fundamental uncertainties that most people do not confront. The deep thinker lives split between internal world where real thinking happens and external world that requires performance of normalcy, experiences emotional life through analytical lens that creates distance from direct experience, struggles with decisions because they see too many factors and too much complexity, cannot simply accept that things are as they are without needing to understand why. This creates life that is rich in understanding but often impoverished in simple, unreflective engagement that involves constant cognitive labor that others do not experience, that requires managing psychological costs that come from thinking too much about everything. Integration is possible but is never complete. The deep thinker can learn to work with the orientation rather than fighting it, can find contexts where depth is valued, can develop selective engagement that allows analysis where it serves while preventing paralysis where quick action is needed, can build intellectual community that reduces isolation, can develop practices that create temporary quiet from the constant thinking. But the fundamental orientation remains. The compulsive analysis continues. The need for depth persists. Understanding the psychology of deep thinkers matters for the deep thinkers themselves, provides recognition that their experience is comprehensible pattern rather than individual pathology, that the costs they experience are natural consequences of the orientation rather than personal failures, that integration strategies exist even when complete resolution is impossible. It also matters for those who interact with deep thinkers, helps them understand why these individuals seem difficult or exhausting or unable to just relax and accept things, why simple conversations become complex analyses, why the deep thinker seems always to be overthinking everything. The deep thinker is not better or worse than those who engage more superficially, but is different, processes reality through different cognitive structures, has different needs and different strengths and different vulnerabilities. The world needs both types, needs those who can engage quickly and efficiently at surface level, and needs those who cannot help but go deep, who see complexity, who question everything, who push toward understanding that surface engagement cannot provide. The question for the deep thinker is not how to become different, but how to live well with the orientation, how to access its gifts while managing its costs, how to find contexts where depth is valued and relationships where it can be shared, how to integrate the analytical tendency with the requirements of ordinary life that often demands quick engagement over thorough understanding. This is lifelong work, is ongoing practice rather than destination reached, is learning to be deep thinker in a world that often rewards superficiality, is making peace with cognitive orientation that brings both profound insight and profound difficulty.